I want to talk now about those kind of lease purchases that are not sponsored by a trucking company. And I'm not familiar with the Lone Mountain lease, so I'm not going to speak about that. I just say be wary of any lease purchase and read your paperwork carefully, because if it's in the lease, they can probably do it. So I want to talk about Quality leasing. Now, Quality has this arrangement where you can put trucks with all sorts of different trucking companies, although the list is getting lower and lower. Fewer and fewer trucking companies will allow you to do a Quality lease to them. So Quality is independent of Panther, and they're independent of other trucking companies whom they allow you to lease to. I think they used to allow people to lease to PTL. But, and this is not to pick exclusively on Quality, but looking at it from the standpoint of a good financial move. Again, I said it's a very expensive form of financing. We had a driver who had a Quality truck on with a major trucking company, who I believe it was Panther too, who during his entire time, 32 weeks working there, had 16 settlements, and he made money on 10 settlements, and he was in the hole on 6. And overall, during that entire time period, his average weekly net after paying the lease and the expenses was $108 per week. That was the average. These are not ways to make money. They're not good ways to even buy a truck, because by the time you survive on $108 a week, let's face it, you're not going to survive on $108 a week. You're simply going to starve before you can ever pay that lease off. Couple other points to make on lease purchases. I ask drivers when they say, should I do this lease purchase? And I'll tell them no, and they say, you haven't even read the paperwork. I said, you don't need to tell me. My experience tells me they're almost always bad deals, but if you want me to read the paperwork, I will. Look at 3 things. 1, look at what you're paying for the truck, as I said early. 2, talk to drivers, get names, work the internet. You can Google a lease purchase name the trucking company and see what other drivers have to say. And ask the trucking company questions and look at the paperwork. So those are things that you want to do. Now, what rights do you have under the contract should the trucking company take the truck? Well, first of all, it depends if you're in default. If you're in default, you don't have a lot of leeway. You don't have a lot of rights. You are not protected by consumer protection laws, because this is not a consumer transaction. It is a commercial transaction. 2 other things to watch for, and that would be to watch for venue clauses in the lease purchase agreement. It may say any dispute between the parties shall be venued in a court in Dover, Delaware, which has absolutely no connection other than with the leasing company or you. The contract may say, the lease purchase may say, if you sue us and you lose, you are attorney's fees. It may also state that you have to go to binding arbitration if there's a dispute and pay half that cost. Remember, typically you're buying these vehicles as is. And if you're buying a used truck, you're probably buying at least some problems. So those are things to look for in a lease purchase, but really look at it if you can make money. I usually pose this question to drivers who want to go into it when I try to talk them out of doing a lease purchase. And I'll say, why are you doing it? Why do you want to do this? And I usually get one of 3 answers. Answer number 1 is usually, I always wanted to own my own truck. And again, my answer is, well, if your name's not on it, you don't own it. And you don't have a lot of rights. Other people say, I want my independence. Well, if you're turning down loads because you want to be able to pick and choose, it may be in very short order that you're not going to get any loads. And typically an owner-operator lease says that the carrier doesn't have to give you any loads. You may be free to turn them down, but they don't have to give you any minimum number of loads. So you turn down enough, they can freeze you up. out. And third is, I wanted to make more money. Well, you're typically, as I indicated earlier, not going to make more money. If the other things you lose by doing lease purchases, you lose protections of many of the employment laws out there. If you are an owner-operator or a so-called lease purchase driver, and you get injured on the job, you probably have no workers' compensation coverage if you break your back and you're disabled for life. Okay, you probably don't have that. You have no protection of the Family Medical Leave Act. So if you need to take time off, they can discharge you. And by the way, if you take time off because your wife has cancer or your spouse has cancer, grandma gets sick, or you want to go to your kid's wedding, your grandson's on his deathbed, you pay the truck payment. Typically, the truck goes into the shop because you've blown rear ends. You might pay for the rear ends depending on the extent of the warranty, but you're going to make that truck payment if you've got 8 months of downtime, 6 months of downtime. There's a lot of reasons not to do these things. And the other thing is the trucking company transfers costs to you that they would otherwise bear. This is perfectly legal. I don't fault the trucking companies for trying to make a profit, but I think it's legal exploitation for the most part. You don't have the assurance of the Affordable Care Act with mandatory coverage. You don't get contributions to Social Security because you're not an employee. So there's lots of reasons not to do them. I would suggest that you not do them. And if you do, if you're thinking about doing, you can call me and I'll attempt to talk you out of it, probably. I do know that the percentages of drivers, in my experience as an attorney for almost 34 years in trucking and working in management prior to that, is that very, very few drivers ever complete a lease and take title to the truck owned free and clear. Some might complete the lease and be persuaded into rolling into another one. Finally, just watch out. You may not be entitled to your escrow account under the lease. So best advice, don't do lease purchases through trucking company affiliates. 2, if you're going to do a lease purchase through somebody other than somebody affiliated with a trucking company, be careful. And 3, if you're naive enough to think you can complete a lease purchase and actually own the truck, make sure you read the paperwork and understand your rights. These are not federal questions that are involved in these leases. Typically, these lease purchases involve issues of state law, and they vary from state to state. So I may not be able to advise you on your rights if this is a lease that's subject to jurisdiction in Alabama or Texas, because it's not federal. These are state questions. Good luck. Be safe out there and enjoy your cruise.